Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we welcome you to the conference BREXIT and its implications on European Union trade and the international business context, for which we have the special participation of Dr. Kalik from University of St. Andrews. We will now leave you with Professor Patricia Marquez, who will be moderating the session. Welcome.
Good morning. On behalf of Universidad del Norte and the Business School, I would like to welcome you all to the session Brexit and its implication on European Union trade and the international business context. Brexit is a topic of current interest in the international trade context because it has created challenges and opportunities for professional businesses and multinationals doing business in or with the UK. Therefore, in this session, those considerations will be addressed both from a European and a global perspective. Let me introduce briefly our guest speaker. Dr. Mahmoud Kalik is a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews School of Management in Scotland. Dr. Kalik holds a Master of Arts in Classic Arabic and Business Studies, a Master of Science in International Business and Emerging Markets, and a PhD in International Business Management at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Kalik teaches international business to undergraduate and postgraduate students. He runs the successful Master Extra program at the University of Edinburgh, which connects guest speakers from university with postgraduate students. Dr. Kalik's research interests are on firm internationalization from developed and emerging markets. He's also interested in firms' strategies that target the base of the pyramid to elevate poverty in an ethical and responsible manner. Welcome, Dr. Kalik.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to the conference this year. It's a pleasure as always to participate. I will just share my slides and let me know if you can see them. Okay, I assume you can see my slides now for my talk on Brexit and its implications on European Union trade and the international business context. So I'm Dr. Mahmoud Kalik, a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And this is just the logo we have for our university. So I'm going to go through a couple of things, obviously, and we'll look at a presentation outline for today's session. So Brexit, of course, this is the hot topic that everyone is talking about, probably the most searched one along with COVID over the last couple of years. And of course, this has had big implications for trade and also for the movement of people, capital, goods and services flowing from inside and outside of the UK. And I like the particular picture I chose here at the bottom, which has the United Kingdom flag leaving the EU basically and trying to go on its own. And we'll look at some of the pros and cons based on some research undertaken on companies' perspectives with regards to what they view is the positive opportunities and obviously the challenges and problems associated with Brexit. So presentation outline, I'm going to go first just through a brief overview of trade and economic integration, just to show the significance and importance of how trade has evolved over time and how we've moved from protectionist measures of trying to boost exports and minimize imports to actually becoming more integrated globally and regionally, of course, with things like NAFTA, the EU, Mercosur, and things like that, that trading blocks that have come into play. Then I'm going to look at one of the other problems we have actually within the whole Brexit story, and that is Scottish independence. So United Kingdom obviously being Northern Ireland, Wales, England and Scotland, there's some problems between England and Scotland as well. And Brexit has added fuel to the fire with regards to this. And then we're going to look at some surprising things, obviously, that happened. There were two surprises in 2016, Donald Trump's election in the US, and of course, the vote on Brexit. Brexit, and then we're going to look at Brexit and obviously the EU, and obviously the challenges that arise in the global economy and international trade as a result of Brexit taking place. So if we start by looking just at the trade history or the brief overview, trade initially began as something economists call mercantilism. And this was the view of trying to boost exports and minimize your imports. And the idea here was the view in the 16th, 17th century that if you had a positive or a surplus on your balance of payments at the end of the year, then obviously you were doing well and you wanted to have a surplus rather than deficits. So one way of doing that was to boost exports and minimize or curtail some of the imports that come. But a definition of free trade, although there are many, it's basically when a government does not attempt to influence through quotas or duties what its citizens can buy from another country, or what they can produce and sell to another country, of course. Now, when we talk about this, there are sort of a number of steps or a number of stages of evolution that occurred. The first one being mercantilism, which was a strong holding philosophy in the 16th and 17th century. Countries like the UK obviously were mercantilist, and this idea of encouraging exports and discouraging imports. It was not until really Adam Smith, who's a Scottish economist, he's actually from a town between Edinburgh, where I live, and St Andrews, where I work. He's the father of modern economics, and he promoted unrestricted free trade. He had a theory called absolute advantage, and his book was called The Wealth of Nations. And the idea here was that firms actually can benefit, countries can benefit by actually importing and exporting with each other and trading with each other. David Ricardo later on built on Adam Smith's ideas, and his theory was known as comparative advantage, which basically explained that countries can improve and have positive effects when they trade with each other, even if one country has an absolute advantage in most products. The idea here is that if countries specialize in the resources they have an abundance in, and they are able to specialize in those, then they allocate resources more efficiently and effectively, and therefore they can trade with each other. And of course, Hexter and Ohlin, Scandinavian researchers, economists, built on Ricardo's work. But we can see a shift here from being having sort of national sovereignty, trying to promote your own exports and minimizing imports, to actually moving towards free trade. And of course, up until Brexit, and even now, in general, we have the most free trade possible of the movement of people, goods, services, and capital than we have ever had before. Of course, globalization has a big effect on this, which really bursts through since the mid-1980s. Trade theory and government policy. So we looked at mercantilism there. We looked at Smith, Ricardo, and Hexter Ohlin promoting unrestricted free trade. There's been other views, or if you like, more recent views, and there's things like new trade theory. And Michael Porter, of course, who's a famous academic as well, talk about sometimes government intervention, limited, but selected intervention is actually needed for certain export-oriented industries. So all the theories really that we have promote the idea of free trade. It's beneficial to engage in trade, but they lack agreement in terms of what recommendations are for government policy and the degree to which government should or could be involved in the process and intervene. So the free trade message that we get generally is adopt an open economy, embrace free trade, and your nation will be rewarded with higher economic growth rates of higher GDP, and higher growth will obviously raise the income levels and the living standards. This is the philosophy or the view and the objective of adopting free trade policies to doing so. So obviously, with keeping Brexit in mind, you think it goes very anti this definition that we have, but we'll look at a couple of things in a few minutes. So just two slides on the case for government intervention. You might be thinking when I said that, is government intervention really good or not? It's the same argument that we have really about whether industries should be regulated or there should be more deregulation involved. So we've seen with financial services a lot of deregulation over the years, but also we had the financial crisis in 2008. and that kind of puts the argument in place that we should have more probably regulation involved. When companies self-regulate themselves, disasters tend to occur. It's a little bit like the saying we have in the UK, when the cat's away, the mice will play. So this could be quite problematic there. But there are some arguments in this infant industry argument, is one particularly for developing countries, because they're behind in catching up with developed nations. Some argue that governments should be there to help create industries and support those industries and maybe subsidize them until they're able to compete and stand on their own two feet with against Western multinational companies. So if you think of cases like countries like Colombia, Egypt, China, this might be actually necessary. However, some argue that this is not very good. It makes industries less efficient, and if they are not going to be efficient in the long-term run, then it's a waste of time, energy, resources, and not fair competition. But if a country has the potential to develop a viable competitive position, its firms should be capable, some say as well, of raising necessary funds by themselves. But we do have some success stories. So if we think of some countries that were developing nations and became newly industrialized countries, so think of the Asian tigers like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They had actually quite government involvement in where they chose certain industries and so protected them until they were able to compete. So we have some success stories based off of that. But whether that movement in the 70s and 80s is still viable today, it might be classified as sort of unfair competition, and obviously the environment has changed. The other one is strategic trade policy. Some argue that any firm that gains a first mover advantage tends to dominate an industry, and so government can have a role sometimes in helping their domestic companies gain first mover advantages, or at least offset some of those first mover advantages so that they're able to grow and overcome barriers and compete. So there are some arguments from an economic perspective and a management perspective of why government intervention is quite important. So when I used to teach IB for many years, we used to have a chapter and a whole lecture I used to do on tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So tariffs being a tax levied on exports of products. It can be a fixed tax, specific tax, or something called ad valorem, which is a tax added as a percentage of the value of the product itself. And of course, then there's non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers are not illegal, but they're unfair trading practices that are involved. But when I used to teach this and talk about subsidies, import quotas, local content requirements, and administrative policies, I used to think this was a thing of the past, because non-tariff barriers were kind of becoming less common as more countries created regional blocks with each other. So when you create regional blocks with each other, you have the free flow of capital, people, services, and goods, and therefore tax and non-tariff barriers should really become more obsolete. And if you apply some non-tariff barriers when you have a treaty or an agreement in place, then you can complain to the World Trade Organization to have a say on this matter, and they try to deal with disputes. However, what's interesting is, well, we thought this was a thing of the past. Brexit has actually brought this to actually be something of maybe the future of things. And if I just go on to the next slide, you can see some of the rise in non-tariff barriers. So subsidies are just things, like government giving money to certain industries or certain companies to help them compete. It's unfair when they compete against other companies that don't have subsidies. But a great example of subsidies is the Boeing and Airbus complaint, always accusing each other of receiving government subsidies that are unfair. Obviously, agriculture as well, which has been protected in Europe and US, trying to protect their farmers against cheaper imports of products from, say, African countries. So that's in terms of subsidies. Quotas obviously is a limit. When a country agrees on, it limits the number of products that enter the market. So if you're importing cars, you might have a limit on the number of cars that can be imported per year. And of course, there's dumping. Dumping is when companies sell a product in other markets, like say steel, below the cost of production, which again makes it unfair competition, and therefore countervailing duties or anti-dumping duties are applied as punishment. And then if we just take a look at the administrative policies with Brexit, this is something that has risen. So administrative policies are things that happen at customs to try to prevent or delay a product from entering. Another word for it would be bureaucratic processes or red tape. That actually occurs. And this has risen significantly and has cost a lot of companies in the UK, particularly SMEs, has risen the costs of their exports to the European Union because of these rise in administrative policies. So it's not a thing of the past. It's actually something that I'm going to have to keep in my teaching, actually, moving forward. Non-tariff barriers are back with a vengeance, if you like. Now, just before we move on here to sort of issues now, as we sort of move more narrowly to the topic of Brexit and Scotland and England, we have levels of economic integration, of course. So as you can see here in the chart on the right-hand side, it's like an onion diagram. The closer you go to the center, the more you are integrated as a trading bloc. So NAFTA is on the far edge, which is just a free trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the US. If we move further in, we have the probably most integrated bloc, which is the EU, which has economic union, which the currency is more or less the same, although the UK still uses the British pound. But the currency is the same. There's abolishment of any tariffs on goods and services, the flow of product, immigration, all that becomes closed. And the aim really with the EU was eventually to reach political union, which is in the center. But of course, now we've had some backlash with Brexit, and we've seen a rise of national sovereignty from countries, whereby they feel that they want more independence and they want their own laws to govern them at home. They don't want a building in Brussels to dictate what happens in English, say, for example, law or Scottish law. What people want is to take that back and take ownership of those things. So political union seems highly unlikely and highly probably very impossible as well for that to happen. But the EU is the closest in terms of economic union. But it seems to be the closer you move towards political union, the more problems that seem to arise from that, like Brexit, for example, and who knows what domino effect it can have over the years. So just to go on to Scotland, or Britain now as such, while we call it the United Kingdom, there are some quite differences between England and Scotland. And I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Braveheart. It's an old movie now. In 1995 it came out, but it won 5 Oscars, based on a true story. And not necessarily everything in the movie is true, but it's based on a true story. And it tells the story of Scotland's greatest hero, which is William Wallace, played by Mel Gibson, fighting for Scottish independence in 1314. Wallace died before independence actually occurred. And in 1314, there was a battle between England and Scotland called the Battle of Bannockburn, and Scotland won their independence from England then in 1314 after many years of struggle to try and gain independence. We even have in Scotland a place called Stirling, which is between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and this is a monument dedicated to William Wallace, our greatest hero. So there's a full monument for his sort of dedication. So there's a lot of national pride within Scotland as well, especially when the movie came out in 1925, of Scottish pride and sort of nationalism to an extent that was in place. So in 2014, no surprise of the date 2014, because Scottish independence was achieved in 1314. So in 2014, we had a referendum. It was a once in a lifetime opportunity, supposedly, by the First Minister of Scotland, who's like the Prime Minister for the UK. We have a First Minister in Scotland, Alex Salmond, who is a graduate from the University of St Andrews as well. And he ran this Scottish independence referendum for yes or no to leave the United Kingdom. And if you can see here, the results here, no won, so we remained part of the United Kingdom. But look at the results, 55.3, 44.7 shows some form of a split that actually exists there. What's interesting is this is supposed to be a one-off, but given the events of Brexit, and we'll look at one of the reasons, one of the important reasons, and about the results of Brexit, has led to actually Scotland thinking of actually having another referendum to leave the United Kingdom. So the results here, as you can see, fairly close, but also I voted at the time for no. But had I known about Brexit and what was going to happen, hindsight's a wonderful thing, I would have voted yes, actually, for Scottish independence. So, and we'll see why in a few minutes. We'll see more divide between England and Scotland. So Scotland remained part of the United Kingdom after that. Now, Brexit as a rising topic, why was Brexit really coming to the forefront? This was really due to national sovereignty, a rise of feeling of nationalism, wanting your own laws at home, wanting to be self-governed, not wanting to have decisions taken for you in Brussels and in Europe was one thing, and immigration was another issue. And part of the EU's problem, even stepping aside even for Brexit, is the growth of the European Union. The member states are too many. Having member states like Germany, France, Holland, Italy, Spain was okay, but adding constantly and growing too fast, I think, was part of the problem, because you have now countries like Romania and Bulgaria, which are part of the European Union. But how many people, for example, from UK or in France and Germany are going to go move and work in Bulgaria and Romania, compared to how many Romanians and Bulgarians are going to seek opportunities within France, UK, and Germany? So immigration is a problem, and England and UK wants to have more control over the immigration policy. And that's one of the main, if you like, sticking points for this problem arising. So we have immigration and we have a rise of national sovereignty. So I put this picture here because it says, have your cake and eat it too. Basically, the UK wanted to have its own cake and eat it. It basically wanted to tell the EU, look, we want to have our own laws separate from you on immigration. We want to have more laws to control our own, issues. But at the same time, we want to remain part of the EU and have free trade with you. So we want the best of both worlds in that sense. And of course, that's not possible and was not part of the agreement when the UK had signed up to being part of the EU. So having your own cake and eat it is nice, but it's very rarely ever going to happen. So in 2016, we have Brexit. And we had 72.2% turnout, which is quite good. And in terms of results, you can see it's very, very close. 51.9% asking to leave and 48.1% asking to remain. Now, on the right here, right-hand side, you can see a map. And the blue part is Scotland, and the bottom part here is England. And you can see here the majority of England voted to leave the European Union, and the majority of Scotland wanted to remain within the European Union. There are obviously exceptions within England as well, like London, for example, and we'll take a look at that breakdown in a minute. But here you can see very close, 51.9, 48.1, and of course it was a mess since then as well. It's not like Brexit happened overnight, but it was constant negotiations and meetings, especially when Theresa May was in power at the time. But if we look at the breakdown here, here's another problem. So we had Scottish independence 2014, and that sort of quieted down as an issue over time. And now look at the results here. We have 52-48 roughly here for Britain. And then looking at England, it's 53% were in favor of leaving, 47% in favor of remaining. And then London, if we take it as a sort of an exception, it's a melting pot, it's a different place full of people from different countries as well. It's a bit of an exception to the rest of England. 40% wanted to leave and 60% wanted to remain. And then Scotland, of course, here, 38% wanted to leave and 62% wanted to remain within the European Union. And then Wales was also similar to the rest of England, wanting to leave, and Northern Ireland similar to Scotland as well, wanting to actually remain. So in a sense, the majority of England has dragged everybody else out of the European Union against their own will, right? So this is part of the problem. Had Scotland gained independence in 2014, England would have left the EU and Scotland would have remained actually in the EU, or would have reapplied and entered. But now Scotland or Scottish people, against their own will, with a high turnout of 62% wanting to remain, are now in trouble and being forced against their own will by the issues dictated by the vote from England. So this has actually led to more talk in Scotland about having another referendum to leave the United Kingdom, again, because Scotland's obviously being punished here, it seems, for something that they did not vote for. Same with Northern Ireland as well. So this is another problem and another issue, is that it's not just, don't think of it as the UK leaving the European Union. It's also problems within the UK between England and Scotland as well. Then, of course, we had Donald J. Trump as well, election 2016, beating Hillary Clinton, which was a surprise at the time as well. And also, very interestingly, America, which has been, promoter of globalization, capitalism, free flow of goods and services, Trump has probably been one of the most protectionist presidents in the modern day history of the United States. Just looking at a couple of things, it shows how he's more mercantilist view. He doesn't see trade as a win-win for everyone. There's winners and losers. He wants to impose tariffs. And of course, there was a trade war with China that you will have read about and seen as well. He says he wants to protect industries, and he also is different to the US policy under Obama, which was more pro-free trade. Trump seems to be anti-free trade unless it's the benefit of the US when he was in power. Obviously now Joe Biden's in power now, but it shows you some of the perspectives that were going on at the time as well. You had Trump as well saying that he wanted to kill the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was signed by the Obama administration. And in the first few weeks of office, he actually withdrew the United States from this free trade agreement. And also Trump had threatened many times that he was going to remove the United States from the World Trade Organization if it interfered with any of his plans to impose tariffs and restrictions. So again, you can see a sort of a U-turn in US policy there, from moving from pro-free trade to protectionism. So at this time, 2016, 17, you could say Donald Trump and the UK were in similar positions whereby they were sort of becoming anti-free trade and not seeing the benefits. So if we look at the impact of Brexit on UK SMEs, what has happened so far, there's a great study in 2019, a longitudinal study published by Professor Ross Brown and colleagues. Professor Ross Brown is a professor at the University of St Andrews, where I work, and he's a leading scholar in SMEs and growth. And in this published study, he looked at the effects and concerns that were going on, and we can take a look at a couple of them here. Brexit-related concerns are escalating, of course. Companies in the study, the larger export and import-oriented SMEs showed most concern, and those obviously located in major urban locations like, say, London. And among SMEs with growth-related plans, many of the firms, due to the uncertainty, scaled back on capital investment, innovation, and especially exports. And we know that's not good for a country when innovation is low, exporting is being reconsidered, and less of investment means less jobs being created. Devolved administrations suggested by Professor Brown and colleagues would be better equipped to enact interventions in order to alleviate the negative effects arising from Brexit. And we'll look a little bit more closely at what we mean by having a devolved solution, maybe, or devolved structures to cope with Brexit as we go through. But this has implications for trade policy, industrial policy, and immigration. And we can take a look at a couple of them here. So supporters of Brexit generally view the UK's departure from the EU as an opportunity to now have an independent trade policy that they want. So again, going back to this idea of national sovereignty, you can now create your own trade policy. To achieve this, the UK would have to leave, obviously, single market and the EU customs union. Opponents of Brexit portray, obviously, a much gloomier picture, whereby the UK could lose access to the world's largest economic zone, the major trading partner for the UK, and resulting, obviously, in major disruption in trading regime. Think of global supply chains, and obviously the companies being able to sell there. So you're losing one of your biggest partners by doing so. I sit in the camp of the opponent of Brexit, so I see it much gloomier, and I'll explain why in a second. I have an interesting statistic related to the costs that are associated with it. But the bulk of the survey that was carried out also by Professor Brown shows that most SMEs express strong preference for retention of EU membership into the single market, of course. And SMEs also express reservations regarding the potential impact of tariffs and customs controls post-Brexit. Increased costs are a particular concern for SMEs embedded within complex EU-wide supply chains. A lot of SMEs sometimes are part of a global value chain of larger companies, and of course a lot of disruptions happens here when there's inputs and outputs and imports and exports going on, and now you're all of a sudden part of a situation where you have higher tariffs and you have more bureaucracy in order to be able to have that global supply chain functioning efficiently. But also, interestingly here, what we can say really is that the non-tariff barriers, such as administrative policies, the bureaucratic processes that are in place, have actually increased the costs for SMEs to export to the EU by 15% at least. So 15% is added on to the cost of producing something and trying to sell it due to these administrative policies, bureaucracy, extra paperwork, and also unfamiliarity and uncertainty with the changes that are going on. So it's costing more, at least up to 15% is the case there. And overall, available evidence suggests that SMEs remain unconvinced of the potential opportunities that can arise by having an independent trading policy. So there's two things here. We can look at short-term policy interventions and long-term policy interventions. And I think by looking at the short-term policy interventions, there's a few things. Transitional support would be useful. It would be probably a very good idea to provide subsidies, which is something we spoke about earlier, to SMEs to exporting to the EU. And that's just to cover the bumps along the road that they will be facing as transition and familiarity takes place. However, this kind of scheme targets exporters only and provides no support for importers who are also having problems, obviously, now and by incurring additional costs during the transition following Brexit. There's the development of a national telephone or online helpline to help assist SMEs navigate through turbulent periods. If you have an online 24-hour helpline, it can allow SMEs to get information that they actually need instead of having to decipher through big files that are still unclear, and it would reduce uncertainty in this difficult and opaque environment. The CBI has advocated such a measure also for small businesses to get questions answered to very quickly. In contrast, a dedicated telephone support helpline service has been established by Scotland in the Scottish government and heavily resourced with 100 staff. But this is just for the short-term transitional period. In terms of long-term interventions, there's a lot of UK policymakers think that they have to implement a more expansive and well-resourced exporting strategy. We're going to have sort of rethink this and redo this from scratch, really, to relaunch it. The key aim of the strategy is the acknowledgement that while fewer than 1 in 10 UK SMEs currently exports, almost the same number, 300,000, have the capacity to become international. So while encouraging these dormant, stagnant, and discouraged exporters, it seems like obviously laudable policy that needs to happen in light of Brexit. In order to overcome the reservations among SMEs towards internationalization as well, changes need to happen institutionally. So the evolved issues become quite important. If we think of Scotland, for example, they have institutional capacity to undertake this type of strategic targeted activity, whereas in England, the LEP network, which operates in England, in its current form is resourced insufficiently to undertake such a strategic role. So Scotland's got more equipped than England is, which is quite ironic considering the fact that Scotland wanted to remain and it was England that wanted to leave. But industrial policy also has problems. So given the large degree of international exposure, it's high-tech growth-oriented companies like SMEs that grow fast and tend to have a global footprint appear particularly concerned by Brexit. So it's not just SMEs, but it's high-tech SMEs. And of course, SMEs are more vulnerable than MNEs. MNEs can deal with shocks more than SMEs because they obviously don't have as many resources as the SMEs. But many growth-oriented SMEs also have yet generally found access to finance quite difficult, and Brexit seems that it's only going to make things more difficult. And here we can see one of the problems again for people like myself who were in favour of staying within the EU, and that's to do with the European Investment Bank. Funding from the European Investment Bank, which is a majority owned by EIB, to the UK SMEs declined by 91% in 2016. And then you have areas in England, like Newcastle, for example, in Northeast, where they have startups, and they benefited a lot from actually EU funding. And one leading study suggests that Brexit could be catastrophic for investment into high growth businesses in the Northeast region. So again, problems here, we need certain policies for certain regions because there's differences within them. So London, we'll see in a second as well, with regards to immigration, how that's impacted it. But we need sort of devolved solutions for different parts within the country. And also we can see here some of the problems of the funding that gets lost by not being an EU member as well. And how do we raise that money to fill in that gap? Capital allowances for SMEs embedded in supply chains are heavily affected by Brexit as well, in a recent study shown. And then immigration policy. This is probably the most controversial and contested policy area surrounding Brexit. Many UK growth-oriented SMEs have overcome labour shortages by employing EU nationals. And this is the case actually for labour-intensive industries, as well as the creative industries or knowledge-intensive ones as well. So part of the problem is that we can see in one of the studies produced more recently that 600 companies that were surveyed across the UK suggest that reduced access to labour since the referendum has led to increased automation. This might be a good thing in the long-term run as things are moving towards AI and automation and robotics. However, at the same time, it shows you that a lot of people, like labour inputs that were needed and were run by EU nationals, now are not going to become available to SMEs to hire. One instance of that actually just recently in the news was Polish drivers, lorry drivers. A lot of them are Polish within the UK. And now I think Boris Johnson is realizing now, oh, we have a shortage now in labour, and we need actually EU nationals to actually run the jobs as before, which was very evident from the beginning. I don't know why he was not able to see that as a problem early on. I mean, it was written on the wall for everyone. But across the UK as a whole, EU nationals account for 1 in 10 UK manufacturing jobs, and the use of EU migrant labour has become prevalent in labour-intensive sector, of course, things like food production, and also a recent study of Scottish seafood processing sector, which is a very big industry within Scotland. One of our biggest exports, along with whiskey, is seafood and salmon. And we find there that 2/3 of employees in this sector originated from the EU. Such as Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania. And this could help explain the high levels of concern, obviously, for these peripheral-based export-intensive SMEs. So it seems to be that the companies, SMEs that are involved already within export activity and rely heavily on that are very concerned, obviously, with Brexit. And those domestic SMEs, which don't have much interest in internationalization or exporting and importing, obviously don't see the threat there, but they should see it because it will impact their future if they want to then start becoming an international company. It's going to be harder for SMEs to become international at a faster rate and growth when you don't have a trading block of free flow of capital, people, goods and services. Urban areas like London also rely heavily on low-cost sources of EU labour, things like construction. And then if we go a bit further as well, we can see that Brexit may also affect the skilled labour as well. And thinking of the creative industries, particularly, 70% almost of creative industries firms employ EU nationals. Given the concentration of the sector in the southeast, this may be an explanation behind the high levels of concern that's expressed by SMEs, especially those in information and communication technology and creative media within London. And you can see London obviously voted, if we think back to the Brexit results, to remain within the EU. Reduced access to talent, of course, you're not going to be able to have that. A growing sector within the UK and in European countries, actually fintech, so financial technology SMEs, and this is going to be more difficult for them actually to gain talent. And some of them obviously have already started to open offices elsewhere within the EU. A competing sector, London is supposed to be the financial capital for Europe. Probably Frankfurt will give a good run for its money in the coming years in Germany. But a recent study also by UK think tank calls on the UK government to implement less stringent and more transparent visa policy. This is something else that's going to have to be reviewed. We're not going to be able to have the same visa policy for everyone, but we're going to have a higher different visas for different industries. And for example, the high-tech industry, which is reliant now on high-tech talent, there's going to have to be fast-track visas that are in place. And also there's other organizations such as the UK Scale-Up Institute and City UK Lobby Group. They've advocated also for fast-track visas for high-tech talent. There was some talk in the UK of adopting a new visa system, and one of those would be similar to what they have in Australia, which is a point-based system for doing so. So if you have like a PhD or a master's degree, you get certain points, and if you meet the criteria, you can get a visa for staying or moving to that country. So that's another idea, the Australian-based model for it being there as well. But you can see there's problems for human capital in terms of immigration. But the UK wanted control over their immigration policy, and now it seems that we have to have a devolution of immigration policy per industry and per region to be able to negate some of the negative consequences that are going to happen within certain industries and regions. So London, for example, relied on a lot of creative talent, fintech, financial industry, which have probably different ways of catering for those industries in that region, whereas other parts of England might not have that issue. Then you have in Scotland companies like fisheries or the fishing industry, which realize exports maybe need their own types of laws in that way as well. So more devolution seems to be better and faster and less bureaucratic for dealing with some of the problems. Scottish SMEs, there was another study, a follow-up study in 2020, another longitudinal one by Professor Brown from St Andrews and his colleagues. And this one actually was a mixed method research. There was a survey and also interviews to corroborate the information. And this is really interesting. Some of the results here, it showed that certain types of SMEs, those which are innovators and exporters, obviously fearful of Brexit, and that was corroborated with the interview data. which found the same issue. There's issues around employment, exports, and innovation. And if there's a reduction in that, it's not going to be good for the outlook in the future for the UK economy. In contrast, the results show that majority domestically focused firms obviously are less concerned because they're less negatively affected. But again, I think this is a very sort of narrow way of looking at things in a short-term view, because any domestic SME company can eventually become an international company, and now Brexit puts blocks in their path as well. So overall, many firms in general in the survey had difficulties operationally and strategically coping with this uncertain and turbulent environment. And what we can say here is some of the issues with government support as well has been, has arisen over the last 2 years. And that's financial and communication. The communication has been quite poor in some cases between, knowing what the law is, communicating it to industries, enabling the companies to enact and have support to making that transition, and financial access as well. And some particular industries that are scared of Brexit and are suffering is the providers of services for people. So care homes, for example, where people take care of the elderly and sick, and they're worried about staff, which have a lot of EU nationals, finance, and the well-being of their patients, which is obviously not something that you can put on pause, but constantly the well-being of patients is going to be important. There's problems for those operating in the shipping industry as well, because they're relying on exports predominantly, and especially those with perishable goods. And this has been a problem within Scotland, actually, for the fishing industry, because the salmon, prawns, all types of seafood only have a short shelf life. And for Scotland to get those products to France and Spain, for example, France, one of the particular biggest importers, they have to obviously, go through a certain stages of process to get them there on time and efficiently. If there's any bureaucracy, time delays, the product is basically wasted. So, and there's been more bureaucratic processes in this area, and they've been complaining about it within Scotland, that things aren't clear, too much paperwork, not clear what's actually happening, and delays causing foods to actually rot. And we'll look at an example of that in a minute. I'll give you an example of something that's quite shocking related to that. Consulting and accounting industry seem to see some benefits of Brexit, but that's obvious. If you think about it, even just an intelligent guess would be that for consulting and accounting industries, because of Brexit, they're getting a lot more work. More companies need consulting on Brexit issues, and so do people on accounting. But this is very short-term view to see this as a benefit. I mean, it may work and maybe more work, initially, but I don't see it being self-sustainable over time and being good. But obviously, initially, it's more work, same as lawyers, more work for lawyers, because of Brexit, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's something good in the long-term run. Agriculture, another issue as well, of course, is concerns around animal welfare concerns, about if there's going to be different laws and how cattle and different livestock will be treated, and if there's going to be some disruption to the well-being of the animals as well. So just to look at a couple of examples here, I just wanted to sort of highlight some of the things that we have had. James Dyson, so he's a big entrepreneur within the UK. He basically does home appliances, so like Hoovers, air dryers. It's the most innovative company within that sector. Almost everyone has a Dyson now in their home. But he was a pro-Brexit. But it seems to be he follows sort of the elite or the class of the elite within the UK, whereby they're supporting Brexit, but they believe Brexit is for the people and not for them. They're exempt from it. And, being a supporter of Brexit, you would imagine that you'd have production and set up in the UK. And actually what he did was he moved his headquarters from the UK to Singapore. And that makes you think. Now, he did say it had nothing to do with Brexit. I have my own, obviously, suspicions, and I'm skeptical about that because the timing is very interesting. So being a supporter of Brexit, encouraging people to vote for Brexit, but then you yourself, tuck-tailing and running and going elsewhere is very problematic. So this is obviously an example of a shock, a disappointment in terms of that. Of course, there'll be other reasons involved in it, like maybe costs. Innovation centers might be better in Singapore than in the UK, but it just seems like it's a little bit of stab in the back after promoting Brexit and you taking your company elsewhere. Nissan also, so Nissan has production within Sunderland in England, employs a lot of people at their production their factory there, producing cars, their plant. And actually, they have decided to stay. They were threatening to leave when Brexit was up in the air and there was no deal being reached between the UK and the EU on what to do. Eventually, they decided to stay, but I'm also skeptical here as to why Nissan actually did stay. They could easily move production somewhere else. I feel there was probably some dealings with the government. I'm not saying in terms of corruption and things like that. There's lack of transparency, but they must have given Nissan a lot of tax breaks and some other incentives and benefits in order to encourage them to stay, because obviously the plant employs thousands of people, and that would be lots of jobs lost if they left. So I'm not so convinced that Nissan just decided to leave of their own, to stay with their own accord, but I believe that they were convinced to do so by the government. And then if we look at Scotland's fishing industry, which has been a bit of a mess since the Brexit issue, we're dealing with products here that have a short, shelf life. And just examples of this, there's the largest salmon producer within Scotland. I was speaking to someone that works there, and they were explaining that now when they try to get products outside of Scotland to the EU, the paperwork has increased. They have to fill a lot more paperwork, which causes delays. And if you fill the paperwork in with the wrong pen color, then the EU applies administrative policies, again, non-tariff barriers, to cause delays. They won't accept it. So it's not just getting the paperwork right, but it's using the right color of pen as well. And if not, that causes more delays. So it's been very strict in that way, and it's been up in the air and a lot of uncertainty as to what goes and doesn't go. So there's another issue of problems arising from there. I don't see it getting much better anytime soon. Another example, which was in the news not so long ago, but it was quite, I suppose, funny when people look at it. It was a UK driver who was driving products from the UK over to Holland, and the TV in Holland quotes that the customs officials were confiscating the ham sandwiches that the driver had, because due to the post-Brexit, that dairy and meat are not allowed in, just like, free flowing. So other ham sandwiches, other products were confiscated off drivers, which shows you a little bit of the ridiculous aspects that are involved in it. It was okay before a vote was held for products to go in and out. Post the vote, we're now looking at confiscating sandwiches off drivers that pack them for their lunch. So that's some of the problems there. And then finally, just looking at Brexit and the international business context, what's my view and outtake on all this? It's actually very gloomy. I don't see any upside to this, and I don't see any upside to it soon. I see more problems between England and Scotland, and possibly another referendum for Scottish independence. I don't see anything being resolved soon for SMEs that are going to be highly disrupted still within the UK, and they're part of global supply chains. This is going to be a problem internationally as well. Big, large companies that can switch an SME that's in their global supply chain in the UK to another country that is part of an economic bloc can actually occur. So there's problems with that. SMEs don't have the resources to cope with uncertainty and disruption as multinational companies can absorb those shocks. UK has less bargaining power, and this is part of the problem when we look at it on a global context. Being part of the EU, obviously you're a bloc. You have more power, you have more bargaining power when dealing with signing different treaties and different trade agreements. But here now, the UK being by itself is going to have less bargaining entity. So think of countries like the US, for example. Who are they more likely to try and strike a better deal with? Is it going to be with the small little island called Britain, or is it going to be the EU, which is a trading bloc that has Germany, France, Italy, Spain involved in it? So you can see where the UK would be in terms of the queue, move further back in terms of that. So their sort of bargaining power, political power, their political and powerful clout is no longer really going to be there. The UK recently signed an agreement, for example, with New Zealand, which means that they're going to import more New Zealand wine and more lamb and beef from there. But New Zealand was always like 23rd, 24th largest partner of the UK in terms of trade. So it's not really an important player that we're dealing or trying to sign agreements with. The bulk of our strength was with Germany, France, and other European countries, which we've now left, which is problematic. So disruption to the free flow of goods, services, capital, and people, I can't see this actually going away. And that's part of the issue that we're going to have here, is the UK is going to have to try and sign more agreements with other countries independently. And it's a waste of time, money, and transaction cost when actually you already had that with being part of the EU. So overall view here, I say it's basically a headache, as you would say in Spanish, gran dolor de cabeza. for the UK. I can't see anything positive. I think it's going to be very problematic. So I don't mean to sound pessimistic. I'm generally quite an optimistic person, but in this case, I have to be a realist based on the studies that I've read and what I've seen going on. I think it's going to be very problematic, and more problems lie ahead for the UK with the differences between England and Scotland. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you found it interesting and insightful, and I will look forward to any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Dr. Kalik, for that impressive presentation. We have one question. It says, are there any immigration incentives for foreign investors? For example, if I want to establish a subsidiary in the UK of my ongoing business.
It would depend on where the company is coming from. So before, it was okay if you were from the EU and you were setting up a subsidiary in the UK, you'd have the free flow of products, of anything there. But now you're going to have to come under immigration law. So if you open a subsidiary there, then you're going to have to come under the immigration law of the UK. The visa situation is going to be applied to all. This is why I was saying in the presentation that we need more devolved solutions. We need different visas, different speed of visas for different types of industries and different types of skilled and unskilled labor. But for the moment, it's still a one lump sum position there together. And again, it depends on which country. If it was a country that UK, like say with New Zealand now, if they're opening subsidiary, they might have issues because there's a separate trade agreement with them, but there's not a separate trade agreement with the way things are going to be with the EU. So that's problematic.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here. Do you think Brexit will encourage or discourage new trade agreements between the UK and other countries outside the EU?
That's a very good question. And to be honest with you, it's the only alternative we have. It's the only alternative we have right now. I mean, if Scotland becomes independent from England, Scotland's objective is to rejoin the EU, and then they would be fine. The problem here, though, is that they're going to have to, and that's why they're signing one with New Zealand. But it's been very disappointing, the countries they've managed to reach and what they've been able to sign in doing so. And that's because the countries that are important are the countries that are in the EU. So this is the problem, is that the countries that we need to be working with, that we had the biggest imports and export relations with, was the EU. And I don't think the US is going to magically solve the problem by covering the amounts that we lose from exports there. But we have to do it, basically. And it has to be something's going to have to give in order for those agreements between the UK and other countries to do so. At one stage, we were talking, actually, just when Brexit occurred, about the Commonwealth countries before. So things like Canada, maybe South Africa, and all those Commonwealth countries could maybe have a Commonwealth Union basically in place. But still, this seems to be a bit disappointing. It's worrying, but it needs to happen, basically. That's here. And just to sort of follow up on that is, had Scotland gained independence in 2014, which I as well mistakenly voted no for because I didn't know Brexit was going to happen. Had I knew Brexit was going to happen, I would have voted yes. And this actually could have put Scotland in a very strong position, because all that would have had to happen is any company that had concern of leaving the European Union could just shift their offices from England to Scotland. So you just have to move up north and set offices in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and that would be part of the EU. So it would be a great advantage for Scotland and a big disadvantage, obviously, for England. But never did I think in my wildest dreams that such a decision would come where Brexit would actually have happened.
Okay, we have one more question. How could Colombia or other emerging countries take advantage of opportunities regarding Brexit?
That's an interesting question, because the two countries I often like to look at when I talk about emerging markets, well, three, is China, Colombia, and Egypt, actually, just from sort of more familiarity with them. It's a tough one. I don't know how it works, because I think England at the moment, I think UK at the moment is panicking with respect to trying to sign agreements with other developed countries whereby their exports or their products are going to be used there. So just for example, before, a lot of high-tech products which are produced in the UK go to Germany and France, right? And Germany and France obviously will import those products. Countries like Colombia and Egypt and China, which are further behind, may not need those products that the UK exports to, right? So it's going to have to be more labor-intensive ones. In terms of those countries, though, if they could sign agreements with the UK, they could benefit by obviously exporting a lot more to the UK of their labor-intensive products. But it would be good if sort of developing countries and countries like Colombia could actually strike some agreements. And this might actually have to become the case. We may be forced in the UK, if we cannot actually get any agreements with any other countries that's sufficient, to start actually looking at other countries to actually form strong trade agreements with.
Okay, thank you very much for answering our questions.
No problem.
Well, it seems like we don't have any more questions. So we thank our guest for his special participation and for this hour full of knowledge. And we thank all of our attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education of talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donations button on the homepage of our platform in Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay connected to the rest of Cátedra Europa's events. Thank you.